Hello. Oh good, the sun has come out again. I don't feel the sun here, so you're in a better position than me. I'm very happy to be here and to be the first speaker in this, what we hope will be a very long series of events extending into the future. I remembered recently a quote from the Spanish writer Octavio Paz. He was asked about communism, what he thought about communism. And he said, communism was the wrong answer, but it wasn't the wrong question. And I think what we're doing here today is to ask the question, which is the question that communism tried to answer, that capitalism has tried to answer, that neoliberalism has tried to answer, that politics in general tries to answer, which is, how do communities work? What makes communities cohere? What do they exist for? And in fact, the even bigger question is, should we be thinking about communities at all? Is it communities that we're concerned with, or is it individuals that we're concerned with? I would define a community as a group of people who've decided that it's in their interest to cohere, to stick together, more than to be separate from one another. So people who belong to a community accept that there are some limitations on their individual freedom which they accept for the benefits of being part of a community. Communities are by definition not groups of unfetteredly free individuals. You accept that there are terms and conditions within a community, and that's part of your membership to them. And of course, each community has its own particular blend of those. Some of them are very common to nearly all communities, like we don't kill each other. Others are quite particular to some communities, like we don't eat bottom-feeding seafood. That's what Jehovah's Witnesses believe, for example. But nonetheless, a community is by definition a certain set of limitations on personal freedom of action in favor of a greater richness and power and coherence of the whole community. And for many, many years, that's what people who've lived in communities have believed and accepted. After the Second World War, when two huge political systems emerged still standing, fascism having been defeated, the question arose of which of those systems is going to be the successful one, which one is going to take us into the future. Now, humans have a unique ability among all animals, which is that we can imagine alternative futures. And in fact, that's what we spend a lot of our time doing. We think we could cross that river if we could build a bridge. What kind of bridge would we have to build? Or we could eat next week if we found a way of keeping food cold enough to survive until next week. So humans and their technologies are all, in a sense, answers to the question of how will we deal with an anticipated future. That's what we spend our time doing. We spend our time thinking about possible futures. We're imaginers. As far as we know, other animals don't do that. Or if they do it in a very, very much more limited way. There is some evidence that our primate relatives can make quite short-term projections into the future, but nothing like the projections that we're able to make. Now, I mention this because I want to point out this is quite non-Darwinian behavior. So I mention it because Darwin is going to come up later in what I'm talking about, and it's important to know that humans do not operate in a Darwinian fashion. By definition, we don't. Darwinism is not concerned with consciousness and the effects of consciousness and knowledge and the ability to project. Communities, though, are held together by one particular emotion, which is hope. Communities only exist on the assumption that there is a future. If there isn't a future, then your best strategy is just to fight for your own corner. Altruism really comes out of the idea that there's some reason to think that in the future I might need your help. just as right now you need mine. There's some reason to want to be kind and helpful and to set up a context of cooperation, because cooperation will be useful to me in the future. I wonder if the sound man could turn down the... Maybe I can turn it down. So, oh dear, that's bad. Is there a sound man? Am I the sound man? I guess I am. So anyway, after the Second World War, we emerged in a kind of a muddle. We had, on the one hand, communism, which I have to say, in my opinion, really won the war. Actually, 27 million Russians died. And in some sense or another, that system was what stopped the Nazis. It wasn't really, though we would like to think, our wonderful battles of Britain and so on. It was 27 million Russians being pushed to the front line to die in front of the Nazis. So Russia emerged looking pretty good out of the war. But so did capitalism, actually. So communism and capitalism emerged. I want to read a quote from a very influential paper that was published in 1953 by Dahl and Lindblom. Robert Dahl and Charles Lindblom. I don't need monitors on stage, by the way. So this was the recognition that by the early 50s, having already seen the collapse of capitalism in the 30s, and having now become aware of the results of Stalinism, both of those systems had sort of shown themselves to be good at fighting wars, but not very good at keeping the peace and developing the peace. They wrote a paper in which they said both capitalism and communism in their raw forms had failed. The only way ahead was to construct the right blend of state, market, and democratic institutions to guarantee peace, well-being, and stability. Then they go on to describe the various forms that were starting to arise, bureaucratic Japanese democracy, freedom thinking Swedish and Scandinavian democracies, and so on. They say what all these various state forms had in common was an acceptance that the state should focus on full employment, economic growth, and the welfare of all of its citizens, and that state power should be freely deployed alongside of, or if necessary, intervening in market processes to achieve these ends. So this was the sort of agreement that was reached in the 50s and which really dominated the next 30 years of capitalism, which are now often referred to as the Golden Age of Capitalism, though I would say golden is a little bit of an overstatement, more like an electroplated nickel silver or bronze or something like that. But nonetheless, for the 30 years after the end of the war, quite a few things happened that hadn't really happened in history before. One was that the wages, the income of people at the bottom of the economic pyramid increased faster than the incomes of those at the top. That was actually unique in the history of capitalism. There was a period which really lasted until the end of the 70s, where if you tracked the growth of productivity and you tracked real wages for people, they were almost linear. In fact, the real wages slightly gained. And this continued actually until the late 70s, which I shall talk about shortly. What also happened was that the Western governments started to realize that their own populations were looking at what was happening in the communist world, perhaps a somewhat rose-tinted version of what was happening in the communist world, but were demanding some of the same freedoms. For example, there was full employment in Russia, by definition. They just invented jobs. Oops. Oh dear, oh me. Could you pick those up? Sorry. Open air always sounds like a good idea, doesn't it? In the communist world, women were treated with much more equality than in our world. Education was free for everybody. There were lots of things that socialism seemed to be offering, and people in the West were starting to demand that, starting to say, well, look, if they can have it, why can't we? So there was a big growth in social movements that said we could have our own version of that. It doesn't have to be Stalinism. We could make something, our own take on this. And in fact, after the war, of course, we had the welfare state, we had free education, we had nationalization of a lot of industries. It's going to happen again. We had for 30 years a state of affairs that, in fact, many of us still kind of believe we live in. What I want to show today is that we don't live in that state of affairs anymore. Now, I benefited. I'm 68, and I'm from a working class background. My dad was a postman. And I realized not long ago that I owe my life, actually, to 4 types of socialism that I was completely unaware of at the time, and I took for granted. I just thought that's how the world is. I realize now that for my children and even for my grandchildren, that isn't going to be how the world is. Things have changed a lot. But they changed rather imperceptibly, and I think most of us, certainly most of us approaching my age, still think we live in that world, and that what we see now are slight aberrations from that. I want to argue that we don't live in that world of community anymore. In that period from 45 to 75, say, or 50 to 80, something like that, one of the other extraordinary things that happened was that there was a huge social mobility. An example of that is what happened in pop music. Sorry. I think I need you to sit next to me on stage.
I'm honoured.
Yeah, make yourself comfortable, have a drink, you know.
Thank you very much indeed. Well, there you go. Sometimes your dreams do come true.
You don't know the other side of the dream yet. So I grew up a working class boy. I passed a scholarship, the 11 plus, which meant that I qualified to go to a local school that kept a Catholic school that kept a few open seats for clever working class boys. I then went to art school, which was of course free, and I spent 5 free years at art school. I then did what many art students do. I left and joined a band, because the secret truth about art schools is that they're really places for making pop music rather than paintings, but they don't admit to that, of course. And during that time, of course, I was seriously ill twice and was saved by the NHS, and I was on the dole for 7 or 8 months. I was on the dole, and I calculate that the amount of money I received during that time was about £500. So I recently tried to work out how much tax I've paid since I've started paying tax, to try to work out how good an investment that was for the government to have supported me for a few months. And I figure they did very well out of that investment. Anyway, that's sort of the idea of thinking of a society not as a race, but as an ecosystem, as a place where there are gains and losses, and the whole system feeds itself and is intertwined and interconnected to be a self-sustaining web of some kind. It's a bottom-up idea. You know, pop music was a bottom-up art form. Very interestingly, mostly managed by ex-public schoolboys. A very dear friend of mine, who was my first manager, died 2 days ago. And he was a public schoolboy from Harrow. I was a postman's son from Suffolk, and we worked together very successfully for many years. That kind of social fluidity was very much a part of the 60s, and I think is still one of the reasons that people are nostalgic about the 60s. It was one of the only times in our history where there has been a real mixing of the classes, as there were, and a sort of dissolution of the classes as well. There was cultural fluidity as well, because the other thing that was happening was that people were starting to listen to music from other parts of the world, and starting to look at art from other parts of the world, and starting to realize that we were not at the top of the cultural pyramid, that in fact there wasn't a pyramid, there was a huge thicket of people doing things all over the world, and we had a lot of connections with each other. So out of that, of course, grew the movement that is now called world music. It's not a very nice term, world music, but it's a very nice idea. Anyway, this takes us up to the end of the 70s, when a counter-revolution started to appear. So one of the things that worried a lot of people about the period of the 60s, the 50s, 60s, and 70s was the dissolution of the hierarchies that had existed before. Now, hierarchies are very reassuring. They look good. They feel secure. It looks like an organization. Networks often don't look much like an organization. They look a bit of a mess, like ecosystems look a bit of a mess. It's reassuring to imagine a world where there are people in control, then managers who sort of disseminate the rules from the people in control, and then the rest of us. There was a whole movement of thinking that had been going on for several years. It originated actually in the 17th century. You could call it individualism. And individualism can be summed up very simply as the idea that the primary driving force in history was the individual rather than the collective. So that the purpose of government and of politics should be to nurture the individual, the gifted individual, to give them as much freedom as possible, and to arrange things so that their particular genius could flourish at its maximum. Sounds like a good enough idea, except that it translates into people like Margaret Thatcher, who was very much part of this movement, coming up with a statement such as, "There's no such thing as society. There are only individuals." I think she said, "and families." She conceded that the family was allowed as a collective unit. But otherwise, her feeling, and the feeling of her mentor, Friedrich Hayek, was that really the idea of the collective was bound to lead to totalitarianism, to collectivism, to the worst excess of communism. Friedrich Hayek's famous book is called The Road to Serfdom, and in fact is a sort of argument against the idea of community or communalism as well as communism, on the assumption that any attempt to suppress the freedom of individuals in favor of the community was bound to end up with Chairman Mao or Stalin. One of the other leading lights in that movement was Ayn Rand. Ayn Rand was a Russian nutcase, in my opinion, but I shouldn't really be so prejudicial. She was a Russian philosopher who lived in America and who was very, very influential and still is very influential. She is one of the primary thinkers of West Coast libertarianism. So people like Jimmy Wales and Alan Greenspan, who was the head of the Federal Reserve, he was very much influenced by Ayn Rand. And one of Ayn Rand's famous statements is, altruism is evil. Again, she felt that individuals dissipating their personal sort of Nietzschean energy to help other weaker individuals was simply a waste of their effort, that they should maximize themselves. What that meant in terms of policy, in the case of Reagan and Thatcher, who were the sort of two leading exponents of this way of thinking, and who unhappily happened to coincide in history, what that meant was, most immediately meant, was cutting taxes for the rich. Taxes subsidized the poor and the weak. And in individualistic philosophies, such as libertarianism, that is simply a waste of energy. So, of course, taxes, as soon as taxes are cut, then social services have to be cut as well, because it's social services that are supported by taxes. As soon as social services are cut, of course, the lower end of society, the part of society that's being helped by those, starts to break up. It starts to atomize. People can't remain coherent as communities because there isn't enough money around for them. There isn't enough employment, so people have to move to places where they think they can find work. People have to work so much that they don't really have the time to engage in community activities. I don't know if any of you have ever read the wonderful book by the wonderful Barbara Ehrenreich called Nickeled and Dimed. Barbara Ehrenreich, who I think is one of the great thinkers actually of our time, she decided to see what it was like to exist at the low-income end of the American spectrum. So she closed her bank accounts and put a lock on them so that they couldn't be accessed. And she then went to California and got a job working in a burger bar. Well, one job wasn't enough to support her, even though she was living 2 bus rides out of town. And if you've ever taken buses in California, you know what that means, 2 bus rides. So she had to get a second job. So she ended up working 2 jobs. I think it came to 14 hours a day of work with additional time spent traveling in between the jobs. And she wrote this book about what the experience of being poor in that way is. Now, I was talking. It's a tragic book. It's absolutely heartbreaking. And if you read it, you'll suddenly start to feel this flood of empathy for the people who have to live in those kinds of circumstances. I was talking to Laurie Anderson recently, and she said that nearly 50% of Americans, sorry, that's not true, nearly 30% of Americans, have less than $400 in savings. That's to say they're one dental operation away from being absolutely destitute. So in individualist philosophies, in libertarianism and in neo-capitalism, which is the sort of neoliberalism, which is the general name for this type of philosophy when it becomes an economic philosophy, those are not seen as downsides of the system. Those are seen as a natural part of the system. They're part of the dynamic where the people who are really disadvantaged will work even harder to try to get back onto the hamster wheel again. So it's seen as part of the health of the system that there is a broad inequality of that kind. There's a writer called Henry Giraud. I don't know if you've heard of him. He's French-Canadian, and maybe his name is pronounced Henri. I don't know. Just let me find the quote from him. Sorry, I do have it here somewhere. Yeah, I don't have it.
I thought one more piece
All right.
down the back.
It's your fault.
I'm responsible for the window.
Yes, you're right. There it is. Thank you.
No, that is what you said.
Thank you so much. Thank you. That was very well spotted. So what Henri Giraud is talking about is the aspect of neoliberalism, which is to do with financialization of all aspects of life. So again, if you do away with the idea of community, then you do away with the notion that there are values other than financial ones that can make people coherent, that can make people want to transact things with one another, to be with one another. So strict neoliberalism is to do with replacing those ideas by the notion of financial transaction. So Henry Giraud says, in an age where everything is for sale, ethical accountability is rendered a liability, and the vocabulary of empathy is viewed as a weakness, reinforced by the view that individual happiness and its endless search for instant gratification is more important than supporting the public good and embracing an obligation to care for others. Atomization, fueled by a fervour for unbridled individualism, produces a pathological disdain for community, public values, and the public good. As democratic pressures are weakened, authoritarian societies resort to fear so as to ward off any room for ideals, visions, and hope. Efforts to keep this space open are made all the more difficult by the ethically tranquilizing presence of a celebrity and commodity culture that works to depoliticize people. The realms of the political and the social imagination wither as shared responsibilities and obligations give way to an individualized society that elevates selfishness, avarice, and militaristic modes of competition as its highest organizing principles. I suppose the key perception of neoliberalism is based really on a misunderstanding of Darwinism. So this is why I mentioned Darwinism earlier. So we look at the natural world and we see that some creatures survive and others don't. And we think, well, it's good enough for nature. Why doesn't it work for us? Why don't we do it? The idea that we could transpose that set of rules that govern the evolution of nature towards us. It seems sort of attractive, and I can even imagine that a lot of people who come from a hippie background, which might be many of us here, would think that it was sort of natural and organic to transpose a kind of natural process like evolution onto human development. I think there are very good reasons for arguing against that. And in fact, I'm going to quote from the most famous neo-Darwinist, Richard Dawkins, as to why that isn't a good idea. That's number 2. Here we are. Richard says, evolution by natural selection is the explanation for why we exist. It is not something to guide our lives in our own society. If we were to be guided by the evolution principle, then we'd be living in a kind of ultra-Thatcherite, Reaganite society. No self-respecting person would want to live in a society that operates according to Darwinian laws. I'm a passionate Darwinist when it involves explaining the development of life. However, I'm a passionate anti-Darwinist when it involves the kind of society in which we want to live. A Darwinian state would be a fascist state. So that's from Richard Dawkins, who should know a little bit about it. However, that Darwinian notion still runs through. We have a culture that tends to view the winners as though they deserved it. It overlooks completely the value of inheritance, for instance, the fact that rich people tend to send their kids to better schools and therefore perpetuate a sort of natural advantage, or an unnatural advantage, actually. It overlooks the fact that if you're very poor, it's not necessarily your fault. There's a sort of underlying thread in neoliberalism that says that people get what they deserve. If they're poor, it's because they were either lazy or not bright enough to put things together differently. But that kind of quantification process that financialization uses all of the time gives rise to some very, very, very strange distortions. I want to read a quote now from Larry Summers, who was the chief economist at the World Bank, just to show you how weird the thinking can become. He was talking about dirty industries, what to do with the products of dirty industries, what are called externalities. This is an email he wrote to somebody, which I'm sure he didn't really want to be revealed, but it was. Just between you and me, shouldn't... just between all of us, shouldn't the World Bank be encouraging more migration of the dirty industries to the less developed countries? The measurements of the costs of health-impairing pollution depends on the foregone earnings from increased morbidity and mortality. From this point of view, a given amount of health-impairing pollution should be done in the country with the lowest cost, which will be the country with the lowest wages. I think the economic logic behind dumping a load of toxic waste in the lowest wage country is impeccable, and we should face up to that. After that memo became public in February 1992, Brazil's then Secretary of the Environment, Jose Lutzenberger, wrote back to Summers, "Your reasoning is perfectly logical, but totally insane. Your thoughts provide a concrete example of the unbelievable alienation, reductionist thinking, social ruthlessness, and the arrogant ignorance of many conventional economists concerning the nature of the world we live in. Don't hold back, Jose. If the World Bank keeps you as vice president, it will lose all credibility. To me, it would confirm what I often said. The best thing that could happen would be for the World Bank to disappear." Sadly, Mr. Lutzenberger was fired shortly after writing this letter. Mr. Summers, on the other hand, was appointed US Treasury Secretary and served through the remainder of the Clinton administration. Subsequently, he was named president of Harvard University. So this kind of very weird, twisted thinking characterizes a lot of neoliberalist thought and, in fact, runs through a lot of the politics of right now. Just to give you one other example of weirdness is privatized prisons in America, which I think are possibly the worst example of systematic government torture in the world at the moment. First of all, you probably didn't know that a quarter of all the prisoners in the world are prisoners in America. Now, America has 5% of the world population, but 25% of the world's prisoners. I think that's amazing. I mean, wouldn't you have thought that maybe China would be the country that you could say that of? It's not, it's America. And so the question is, why are there so many prisoners in America? Well, one of the reasons is because about half the prison system now is privatized in America. And the companies that run the privatized prison systems, The two biggest companies have an annual take of about $4 billion a year. And they spend a lot of money lobbying. And do you know what they lobby for? They lobby for mandatory prison sentences. Of course they do. Prisoners are their businesses. Prisoners are us. They want more people to be in prison. So they lobby for mandatory prison sentences for more and more trivial crimes, or misdemeanors even. And they lobby for longer sentences. They lobby against parole systems. Basically, they lobby to swell the prison population because that's what they do. That's their business. Not only that, they have agreements with the states that they work in that they don't handle the difficult cases. So, for instance, a lot of people are in prison in various ways because they have psychological disturbances. They've done things as a result of not being particularly in balanced states of mind at certain times, and they've ended up in prison for it. Well, the privatized prison companies know those types of prisoners are expensive and difficult to deal with, so they don't take those ones. Those ones stay in state prisons. So this is a classic example of something that happens so much now, of privatizing the profits and socializing the costs. You take the profitable part and you let society deal with the difficult part. Another example of that, which seems much less, let's say, pernicious, but actually I think is also a very contentious subject, is to do with research and development. Now, I don't know if you know that a lot of money is spent on defense research. And I think one of the reasons that happens, actually, is, apart from the fact that governments enjoy being militaristic, it seems, but one of the other reasons it happens, it's because it's a way of funneling money into research without public scrutiny. It's a way of having a kind of communist-style command economy right at the center of a capitalist economy like ours. The government can direct where that money goes into what kind of research. So it's very handy if you want to be able to spend money on some blue sky research without going through the embarrassment of government committees and so on. There's a writer called Mariana Mazzucato, who's an economist, who wrote a book called The Entrepreneurial State, in which she shows how, for the last 30, 40 years, governments have been spending money on research which private companies have then been using to make products from. This is great, it's fine, except the private companies don't return any of the research money to the government. So essentially taxpayers' money is financing private industry. It's another case of privatize the profits and socialize the costs. And one of the examples she gives in her book is the iPhone. So she has a wonderful page where there's a diagram of an iPhone and little pointers, all the innovations in the iPhone. So there's GPS. Okay, this was paid for by the Department of Defense, developed throughout the 80s. Then there's touch-sensitive screens. This was paid for Department of Advanced Research Projects, also another kind of defense-related department in America. In fact, every single technological breakthrough in the iPhone was paid for by various government departments. And of course, the internet itself, the original development of the internet, was not paid for by Google and Microsoft and Yahoo and so on. It was paid for by CERN, which is a public body. It was paid for by the British government, actually, who supported Tim Berners-Lee for some of the time. So the point she's making is that these private companies are sort of sucking up very expensive research, repackaging it, selling it, keeping all the profits, and not paying their taxes if they can avoid it as well. So you have a kind of double a double deceit there. Which in neoliberal terms, by the way, is perfectly acceptable. That's the way business should be done. Another way that business should be done is by what are essentially strong-arm tactics of international organizations like the IMF and the World Bank. I was reading recently about the debt crisis in Mexico in the 90s. It's not easy to summarize, but essentially it ended up with the IMF demanding that Mexico neoliberalize its economy. And what that usually means when it's applied to countries is you sell your assets. So public assets get sold to pay international debts, essentially. And within 2 years, there were 24 billionaires in Mexico as a result of this. These were people who bought up all those public assets in much the same way as in Russia in the 90s. People bought up all what had been state-owned assets. And of course, this isn't without consequences for the rest of it's not just some people get rich. A lot of other people get much poorer. So again, you have this dissolution of communities because communities require a certain amount of basic infrastructure and money and sheer resources to hold them together. They don't exist entirely in the abstract. They're people. And by sucking money out of the bottom of society, which is what these kinds of processes do, you weaken the bottom of society so much that it can't function anymore, it can't cohere. The one way it can cohere, though, which is something that all authoritarian governments have realized, is through fear. If you can't hold people together through joy, you can hold them together through fear. And I think we've seen in our own recent history what the results of that are. If you can point to an enemy, you can somehow hold the society together. I mean, I often think what a huge sigh of relief it must have been for the Americans in some ways when Al-Qaeda appeared, because they'd been looking for an enemy. You know, they'd tried China, and that was embarrassing because half of America was owned by China. And they'd tried Russia, and that didn't quite work. And then suddenly Al-Qaeda appeared, and the perfect enemy, you know. They wear funny clothes, they're Muslims, and they're mad. And we don't have any investments in them. Militarism is, I think, the primary disease of neoliberalism because it turns out to be the only way that you can create any kind of social coherence. If you can't do it through shared aspiration, through equality, and through some sort of sense of social justice that makes people want to hold together because society works for them, then you have to do it through defensiveness and fear. So I think our societies, England certainly and the US in particular, those two, have, without us really noticing it, have morphed into a different kind of society. We've morphed into societies that are ready to accept torture. I was mentioning earlier about prisons. Of those 2.5 million Americans who are in prison, of course, most of them are blacks. Most of them are in there for quite minor misdemeanors. And 88,000 of them are in solitary confinement. Now, some of them for 40 years. Can you imagine that? 40 years of solitary confinement. This is just sheer torture. And we sort of don't notice it somehow. We point to other states as being torture states, but we don't notice that we're doing it too. So anyway, that's the bad news so far. Now, sorry, does anyone know what the time is?
Yeah.
I just suddenly realised I've got to pay.
Just
Okay. All right. So the good news is going to occupy a bit less time than the bad news did. So the question now, of course, is what do we do about it? If we acknowledge that we've slipped into this other kind of society, which is probably not a society that any of us wanted to be in, it's a society that doesn't seem to be producing very good results. How can we change it? What can we do? I'm going to start with a quote from a young man called Raul Martinez. He's just written a book. It's out next month. I was lucky to get a pre-publication copy. I think it is absolutely a fantastic book. It's called Creating Freedom, and I think it's going to really be a very important book. So he's talking about what I'm talking about, how do we change the world? And he starts his section on that with these words. The first obstacles to be overcome on the path to creating freedom will always be internal, for what we do is a reflection of who we are. If we want a more compassionate society, we must try to be more compassionate. If we want a more informed society, we must try to be more informed. If we want a freer society, we must try to live as if we are already free. Compassion, truth, and freedom aren't distant goals to be won once we destroy a system or vanquish an ideology. They're actually the tools for creating the world we desire. So in that spirit, I now go into some proposals. There are so many things to fix that one is almost baffled by the choice. And of course, what you want is to have maximum leverage. You want your effort to translate into the biggest result it can. There's a book by a guy called Paul Steinberg, and I can't remember the title of the book, I'm afraid. He talks about social rules, these sets of rules and structures that underlie what we all do and what we can and can't do. And he says that those are the places that we should be looking to make changes. He says social rules include a lot of the things that we know by different names, from city ordinances to public policies, constitutions, product design standards, and cultural norms. We tend to describe these in different ways. Different groups of professionals are concerned with different types of rules, but in fact, when you look at these things as a whole, it becomes apparent that there's a vast network of rules. I call it the world's largest machine that underlies society and that drives countries and communities to either embrace sustainability or to run in precisely the opposite direction. He was talking particularly in this case about environmental legislation. But I think what he's saying is that this wonderful idea of the world's largest machine being actually networks of rules, I think that's a very powerful notion, and the idea that you change the way that machine works as a way of changing society appeals to me a lot. In fact, there's an NGO that I'm associated with called Client Earth, which is a group of lawyers who are all environmentalists and decided that the way to deal with environmental issues was by creating legislation, and not only by creating it, but by making sure that it was enforced once it had been created, which is actually turns out to be the bigger problem. Lots of countries sign up to environmental legislation, but then they don't actually follow through on it. So what we at Client Earth have been doing is, first of all, getting legislation drafted, but then taking governments to the European Court when they didn't enact the legislation, which they frequently don't. Now, of course, you probably think, as I thought, since Brexit, we'll be out of Europe, and therefore we won't be subject to their environmental legislation, so it's all going to go downhill. I think there might be a different view of that. Since Brexit, we'll be out of Europe, which means that Europe will be able to enact its environmental legislation without having Britain constantly torpedoing it, which is what we were doing. And thanks. Give me a chance to have a drink. Just applaud a bit more. Thank you. So probably if we want to continue having any trade relationship with Europe, which we will probably be bound by most of the same environmental rules that Europe is anyway, otherwise they won't trade with us. So it might turn out that we end up with de facto better environmental legislation as a result of not being able anymore to interfere with it. This is anyway what my lawyer friends think will happen. Sorry, that was just an aside. But certainly the rules, which are the kind of unglamorous side of how the world works, turns out, I think, to be the very important part of how it works. That's the structure from which everything else is generated. Now, you either deal with outcomes, which is to say you try to patch up the results of situations, or you try to deal with the system itself. You try to deal with making the system work differently. And I certainly am much more attracted to that latter course of action because I think it has much higher leverage. It means that you can put a system in place that then carries on working when you leave it. It'll still be there. It will still be working in the way you want it to. So that's the substructure that we have to deal with. Then we have to deal with a very difficult problem. If we want to live in a democracy, and as per my earlier definition, democracy is really ruled by the community, the idea of the community ruling itself, generating its own rules. If we want to do that, we are relying on the quality of the information that the community has. This is a huge problem. Once again, recent weeks have shown us what happens when the information isn't good. What happens when the organs of information are in the hands of a few people with very particular political interests. Of course, I'm talking about Rupert Murdoch, who I think is really one of the forces for harm on the planet right now. A very dangerous person. Thank you. I don't know why I've got a very dry mouth. Is there any way that we can regulate the quality of information that we get? For instance, could there not have been some system in place that when the leavers were publishing that £350 million a week was being spent into Europe by the British, as though we were just sort of handing truckloads of money into Europe for no return whatsoever? Couldn't there have been any way, can one imagine a way in which somebody could have said, hold on, that's actually not true, and we would have heard that message? How come that in a sophisticated modern society we don't have a way of checking information like that? How come there isn't some system of expertise and reporting that sorts those kinds of things out for us? We had Michael Gove saying, I think the British public have had enough of experts. I can tell you this bit of the British public's had enough of fucking Michael Gove. Yeah. Thank you. I try to pitch my jokes to dogs as well. I'm glad it works. Intraspecies joking. The media problem is really a very big problem. It's a huge problem in America as well, where you now have a presidential candidate who may even become president, who is almost entirely a media artifact. Who knows what he believes? Who knows what he stands for? What he's ever understood? He's a product of the appetite that television has for orange people, I guess, for weirdness. Somehow that has to stop. There has to be, first of all, we have to stop believing it, but we have to have other ways of talking to each other. Well, hopefully things like this, the development of that, blogs, all the non-media type of ways that we communicate with each other. Okay, quickly I'm going to run through some other areas that we've got to be looking at. Politics. Tony Benn asked 5 questions, which I think should be asked of every politician. What power do you have? Where did you get it from? In whose interest do you exercise it? To whom are you accountable? And how can we get rid of you? That really should be asked of every politician. Somebody in America had a funny idea, which I think was a very good idea, where he said that once a year every politician should come out wearing a suit made up of patches of different colour representing the different lobbies that support him. So, you know, the tobacco industry is this whole sleeve and that side, and then here's the farmer down here. So once a year everybody gets to walk around with their affiliations clearly displayed. New voting systems, I think, are very important. You know, in Australia, now, voting is now compulsory. I don't know if that's such a good idea given the results they've had so far. But there are thoughts about, instead of having campaign donations, which have completely distorted American politics, absolutely a clear form of corruption to me, just as corrupt as everything we point to so sort of self-righteously going on in Nigeria and Russia and so on. Campaign contributions is pure corruption. It's just bribery, you know. So there are some countries now talking about experimenting with the idea of giving each citizen £100 or £500, which they can give to the political party of their choice. So the campaign contributions are made by citizens or made by the choice of citizens. Double voting is another idea. I was talking to a physicist from Princeton the other day who said that they never vote on anything once. They always vote twice. So they take a vote, then they think about it, get the result of the vote, think about it, and then they vote again a week later. I wonder what would have happened with Brexit if that had been done. If everybody had woken up that day and thought, oh shit, we've done it, and then had a chance to revise the vote. I think we need on our voting forms something that says none of the above. Don't you think that all Americans must be thinking that now? I mean, Christ, Trump and Hillary, what's the choice, really? Well, of course, I'd prefer Hillary, but just as I would prefer to be bitten by that dog than a snake, perhaps. And that's only because he laughed at my joke, actually. There's a sense that at the moment we're trapped in a system that is so crude at the end. Whatever the amount of complex thought that goes into it, it ends up with this simple binary decision, him or her. It just doesn't seem like a good translation of all the intelligence that is behind it. You know, there's so much intelligence. The notion that it gets reduced to a simple choice like that is offensive somehow. The other thing we have to fix, of course, apart from the many obvious corruptions of politics by money, are the revolving doors where people leave, for instance, the Department of Defence to be given a directorship in a major defence company. That can't be a good idea when there are such strong ties between your personal financial interests and what you're supposed to be legislating. Oh gosh, sorry. Technologies, very quickly. We have to start being honest about technologies. There's such a lot of, among our side of the argument, let's say the liberal left or whatever, there's such a lot of sentimentality, I find. I will offend you all by saying that I support both nuclear energy and GM. Not in the hands of Monsanto and people like that, but I think that both of those technologies have good track records so far. And we really owe it to ourselves to start being a little bit more dispassionate about assessing them. I probably shouldn't have raised that issue without being prepared to argue it, but I don't have time now. I also think we should be thinking about geoengineering, another thing that offends the sentimental. My friend Stuart Brand said, we're as gods, so we might as well get good at it. Business, we should be now thinking about how we deal with businesses that won't pay their taxes, how we deal with unionization. Unions produced amazingly good results. I think that they are the sort of unspoken heroes of the modern age, the union organisers. And they've been demonised. We've been told that they're part of history, just like Corbyn is part of history. They've got no place in a modern world of thrusting individuals. Well, they have a huge place to play, I think, and I really believe that we should be pushing for the reinvention of unionisation. You know, there are plenty of countries that do it perfectly well. Germany has had unions for a very long time. Unions routinely sit on the management boards. They don't have big problems about it. They don't sort of turn it into a class issue. They say these people are working. They know things that we don't know. If you're on the shop floor, you know things that the directors don't know. Why are we not capable of taking that attitude? Okay, I've got to finish actually. I'm going to read two last things. One is from Raúl Martínez again, whose book you will definitely want to read. I have no financial interest in it, so I read it and I was so excited by it that I read it again, and it's a big book. It's called Creating Freedom. He says, decades of conditioning have told us that greed is good, that society is an illusion, and that people tend to get what they deserve. We've been sold an impoverished version of humanity, one that binds our imagination and erodes our hope. We are told that this is freedom. Deep down, we know this is a myth, one that's promoted to justify a world of destruction, exploitation, and injustice. Behind the technical debates of the economists, the ideological rows of the politicians, the pursuit of corporate profit, and the passionate protests of the public, is the most important question we can ask. What is life for? To compete, accumulate, and dominate? Or is it to love and be loved, to create, share, and experience beauty? And then, I need the first part of this. My last words are not my words, they're the words of the historian Howard Zinn, American historian. And they're optimistic words, I think. To be hopeful in bad times is not just foolishly romantic. Actually, it doesn't really seem like bad times sitting here in the sun, but it is for a lot of people. It's based on the fact that human history is a history not only of cruelty, but also of compassion, sacrifice, courage, and kindness. What we choose to emphasize in this complex history will determine our lives. If we see only the worst, it destroys our capacity to do something. If we remember those times and places, and there are so many, where people have behaved magnificently, This gives us the energy to act, and at least the possibility of sending this spinning top of a world in a different direction. And if we do act in however small a way, we don't have to wait for some grand utopian future. The future is an infinite succession of presents, and to live now as we think human beings should live, in defiance of all that is bad around us, is itself a marvellous victory. Thank you.